Hi, everyone. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you to the Network for Responsible Public Policy's May program covering the issues of Ukraine. So we've got a lot to cover, but before I have you meet our speakers and facilitator, I'd like to talk briefly about our Q&A session, because we believe the Q&A session is just as important as the presentations you're going to be hearing. We really want to have all your questions and concerns addressed. So if you will, submit any of your questions now by going to the Q&A tab. And then as the questions occur to you during the program, please submit those as well. And we have Lee Chinitz, who's a board member of NFRPP, and he's going to organize all the questions for our participants. And then we'll see you at the end of what we think is going to be a very stimulating and terrific program. So I'm going to have you meet our facilitator, Gideon Rose. Gideon Rose is the Mary and David Boies Distinguished Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council for Foreign Relations. He was previously editor of Foreign Affairs from 2010 to 2021. He served as Associate Director for Near East and South Asian Affairs on the staff of the National Security Council and under the Clinton administration. His most recent articles in Foreign Relations are Why the War in Ukraine Won't Go Nuclear and the Irony of Ukraine. If you want to know more about Gideon Rose, please Google Gideon Rose. So Gideon, hello and welcome. And please start the program and have everybody meet our terrific speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhoda, and thanks for this opportunity, and thanks to all of you for attending. The responsible and public policy aren't words you usually see in close conjunction these days, so it's delightful to be with this tiny little handful of refugees from the past in the world that we would like to be in, to discuss some of the really terrible things going on in another part of the world, which is close to many of us, although distant in space. We've all been following this crisis from its crisis mode in which war seemed possible to the Russian invasion in February, to the heroic resistance by Ukraine, to the humanitarian catastrophe that's played out, to the fortunes of war, which have turned in recent times increasingly in some ways in the Ukrainian direction. And we are at a fabulously interesting and important time to assess what's going on, because the contours of much of this, of what's happened to date, are now familiar, but as we approach the end game, the questions of what happens next become ever more important. And we go from purely military analysis to the kinds of strategic context and political and social and human analysis that our extraordinary speakers can bring to bear. We are greatly privileged today to be able to chat with two wonderful experts, the kind of people that all the rest of us turn to for knowledge and guidance and wisdom in times like these, because unlike everybody else who's talking about Ukraine and Russia, they actually know about it. Timothy Fry is the Marshall Schulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia. Oksana Shevel is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts. Both of them have numerous publications and great professional specialty expertise in many facets of the subject, which we won't go into. You can read it online. And what I'd like to do is get right to the heart of it. So what we're going to do is they're each going to make a short opening presentation on some aspects of the situation that they're uppermost in their mind. I'll engage them in some back and forth, and then we'll have a general discussion with all of you as well. So Tim, why don't you start us off? What is at this point in the war, what are the key things we need to know, and what are the things that are on top of your mind? You're muted.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the generous introduction. I'm really looking forward to our discussion and the questions that we get from the audience. For a long time, I've made the case that when we look at Russia, the two frames that we usually use don't get us very far. We tend to look at Russian politics through Vladimir Putin's worldview and occupational background. And we often reduce Russian politics to a single individual. And we get more portraits of Putin. What does Putin really want? Those only get us so far in that I don't know what Putin wants. He doesn't talk with me about these things, and he's a politician. So of course, he never reveals what he is truly thinking, and he's always trying to spin. I don't say that to disparage him, but this is what politicians do. Also, he's running a country of more than 140 million people. It stretches across 11 time zones. That's well educated, that's urban, that until recently was integrated into the global economy. So clearly he's not doing this himself. And he faces the same kinds of trade-offs that all autocrats face. How do you keep your inner circle happy and not revolt against you? And how do you keep the masses off the street, which is the other threat to all autocrats? And the problem is that resolving those two threats is difficult because reducing one of those threats typically makes the other one much worse. So for example, Putin has used massive corruption to enrich his cronies and keep them happy, but he can't allow them to steal so much that the economy collapses, which would bring people onto the street. And as we look in terms of propaganda, there has to mix in enough truth so that people keep watching, but also mix in enough lies so that they get the Kremlin point of view out. So I think we're much better about thinking about Putin as an autocrat like lots of others, who faces these very common trade-offs and bring politics, real politics, coalition building, persuasion, the occasional use of repression back into our analysis about Russia. The other way people talk about Russia is some kind of eternal Russia that's been unchanged for the last 300 years, as if there's a continuous line in Russian history that allows us to predict what Russia is going to do next. But as I look back over the last 300 years, I see much more variation. Sometimes Russia has cooperative relations with the West and sometimes not. Sometimes it devolves a lot of political power and sometimes it concentrates it. Sometimes it invades its neighbors and sometimes it's not. And what we need to do is try to figure out, why it does one thing one time and one thing another time, rather than just assume based on a simplistic reading of Russian history that it kind of moves in one direction. So I really think that we should need to take the politics of Russia very seriously and not reduce it to the psyche of a single individual. That said, I'm going to seem like I'm contradicting myself, but hopefully not. In foreign policy, leaders matter a lot. And during crises, leaders matter even more. And the tragic and fascinating thing about Putin's decision to invade Ukraine is that prior to the invasion, 80% of Russians in public opinion polls were perfectly satisfied with Ukraine as its own sovereign state. In repeated surveys, only 20% of Russians thought that Ukraine and Russia should unify into a single state. Even on the eve of the invasion, you got a bare majority of people who were willing to even recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk republics. That's not even incorporating them into Russia. So it's not as if there was this massive demand from below for this kind of action. And even among the elites themselves, there didn't seem to be a lot of support for this. Putin's inner circle of security people that he listens to the most hate the West. There's no doubt about that. But they don't seem to have Putin's obsession with Ukraine and his belief that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. That really seems to be fairly specific to Putin. So in this case, I do think that Putin is the ruler of Russia really is critical to this decision. And I think that's important so that we recognize how contingent the decision to invade Ukraine was. And it wasn't some kind of monumental clash of forces that was somehow unavoidable. I sincerely believe that a different leader, even one that was an autocrat, even one that was very anti-Western, might have made a very different kind of decision. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Gideon and Oksana.
You are muted, Gideon.
Right, so, okay. Before I get to Oksana, in 1 second, I want to do a quick little follow-up to you, which is put it in quick words then. If he didn't do it from pressures from the society or from his elites, why did he choose to invade? We'll unmute Tim.
Oh, there we go. It's even more of a puzzle because it seems to have just been a really horrific mistake. Part of it was the structure of the political system, which gave him information, which I think led him to overestimate the capacity of Russia. This is hardly unique to Putin. This is a systemic factor that in these kind of personalist autocracies, particularly ones that have been in power for a long period of time, you tend to get surrounded by yes men. But I think the other factor is Putin sees himself as righting what he sees as an historic wrong, that somehow Ukraine was torn away from Russia, and that yes, now things are horrible, the costs are very high to this operation, but in 25 or 30 years from now, when Russia controls or dominates Ukraine or Eastern Ukraine or some part of Ukraine, it will all seem to have been worth it. I don't share that view. I think it's a mistaken view. I think events on the ground are showing that it's wrong. But I think that's the way to justify, that's how he justified the decision, I think, to himself.
Got it. Oh, well, lots to talk about here, but Oksana, bringing you in. Okay, you're opening.
Yes, thank you. I was actually going to, in some way, picking up where Tim left off with this kind of, and your question, like, why did Putin do this? I think the ideas matter, and I think Putin's obsession with Ukraine is important. I mean, I agree with Tim that this, we kind of have to analyze politics and not just the decision of autocrat, but given that it is such a small decision-making circle, that it is such a highly authoritarian state, and by some accounts, it was actually almost like Putin's single-handed decision. Like, yes, he consulted with some small circle, but this, decision to invade was ultimately his. And I think the way he views Ukraine is very important. And this is one of the points I wanted to make in my remarks, like the fundamental misperception of what Ukraine is, what it has been, and most especially what it has become since 2014. And it is really ironic because in many ways, up until the beginning, this war, we can actually date it back to 2014 when Russia first, through aggressive action, annexed Crimea, sponsored the separatist quasi-republics in Donbass. And that was all done to prevent Ukraine from turning away from Russia, from Russian sphere of influence, following these Euromaidan protests that drove the pro-Russian president out. But sort of the irony of it is, at least as I see it, that in Ukraine, there was historically quite strong pro-Russian part of the electorate. Again, for historical reasons, the east and the south of the country had more Russian-speaking population. Not all sort of this division is quite complex, but, if we simplify it a little bit, it's fair to say that there were people there, a substantial number of people who wanted kind of closer relations with Russia, not necessarily the same state, but certainly Russia had a lot of leverage through basic democratic politics to have pro-Russian politicians occupy, sometimes pinnacles of power, and Ukraine certainly have substantial representation in the parliament. And that has not changed after this pro-Russian president Yanukovych was driven out. But what happened sort of ironically, once Putin decides that this was this sort of now or never kind of Ukraine is fundamentally turning away from Russia, and he went to annex Crimea and started the separatism in Donbass, we saw a sea change in Ukrainian attitudes in the historically pro-Russian parts of the country. And Putin dismissed that evidence. I mean, he's on the record when he was explicitly asked, what does he make of opinion polls that show that now in the South and the East, more people support, say, joining NATO, which they never supported before, right? More people share certain historical kind of interpretation of history that was not pro-Russian. And he basically would say that these either opinion polls are fake, or, people are afraid to express their true pro-Russian preferences because they are ruled by the quote-unquote Nazi government, right? And he seemed to have genuinely believed this. Again, in part, we saw the purges in the Russian security apparatus, not least because, the information he was fed or he chose to kind of absorb led to this fundamental miscalculation that they were hoping, and that was the narrative, that the Russian army is coming to liberate Ukrainian people from these Nazi who have been ruling over them. And they were expecting a warm welcome, and they're not receiving that. Like anywhere in the south of the country, in the east of the country, the most pro-Russian areas historically, there is now resistance. There have been protests before they were crushed by the FSB. There is partisan activity. So they really, I think that was sort of fundamental misconception about Ukraine. And then it raises the question, what can Putin do about this? They can't even stage a fake referendum, right? So it really constrains and I think limits the options that they have. Yes, they can try to annex territory outright. So that's kind of one, I think, important thing. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I think the way Ukrainian agency is very important. This is something sometimes it's lost in the Western, some of the Western analyses, sort of like, what should Russia do with, like US should do with Russia, and kind of like as if over the heads of Ukrainians, you can have some sort of agreement. But I think that's a big mistake to think that way. Ukrainian people have a lot of agency, and most importantly, that they are determined to fight because they see this as the fight for survival as a nation and a state. So again, the way the narrative has been coming from Russia about the so-called denazification, what does it really mean? Is it really going about some fringe far-right movement in Ukraine? No, it is really going about political elites, the people, the activists who have explicitly pro-Ukrainian position. And these are the enemies. We see that in the arrests and destruction and killing of pro-Ukrainian activists, of journalists, of civil society leaders. We see this in the going after Ukrainian language school teachers, erasing signs of Ukrainian statehood from the occupied territories. So the way the Ukrainians see it, any kind of territorial concession, potentially to give Putin, quote unquote, an off-ramp, is just not acceptable, because that would subject people on these occupied territories to brutal occupation, to torture, to murder, to disappearance. And Ukrainians are determined to fight. And the opinion polls show that over 90% believe that they can win. Is Western aid very important in this regard? Absolutely. But I would argue that even if there wasn't, first of all, different countries might kind of choose differently. We can maybe get to it in the Q&A, kind of how the collective West responds. But this determination of Ukrainians, again, they see it as not about kind of, security. They really see it as about fundamental right to exist as the nation and the state. So I think that's very important. So again, it raises this question: is it about NATO? Is it about Putin's imperialism? Probably both play some role, but I would kind of be on the side, take an argument that it was not primarily and certainly not exclusively about NATO. I think Putin's designs and his issues with Ukraine go much, much deeper than just security alliance of the country. It is really goes about towards memory politics, towards linguistic politics, towards economic reforms, towards local administration. He believes essentially there is a sort of Western meddling, right, in every, as he said, down to the level of the last municipality, down to the level of the last platoon. And Ukrainians see it, we have to fight for the right to exist. So the last point I would make, if we're thinking about sort of what's in the future, right, I think I would suggest that there are, at least from the Ukrainian side, kind of three levers, maybe we can say 3 levels of what concession is possible or not possible. I think succeeding any additional territory, basically the ones that was conquered since February by Russia so far, is completely unacceptable. So I think Ukraine would not agree to any kind of Putin face-saving off-ramp if that's what, say, he were to offer ceasefire and kind of freeze the war. Now, when it comes to the territories occupied before before this invasion, the Crimea and Donbass, I think here there is a little bit of a difference. And here again, I would draw a distinction between Crimea and Donbass. I don't think Ukraine would go as far as trying to reconquer Crimea militarily for all sorts of reasons. We can talk about that. So even if they had military capacity, which is not clear. And I think Donbass kind of falls in between. Yes.
I'm sorry. Could I just ask you to try and slow down a little bit? We've had a couple of requests that you take the pace down just a tad. If that
okay, I'll try. It's just okay, but I'm pretty much done. So I was just going to say that I think when we think about kind of possible settlement. First of all, I think the settlement would be determined ultimately on the battlefield, because whichever side has an upper hand militarily, that would be the one that would be dictating these terms of settlement. But I think for Ukraine, again, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, I would draw this distinction between the territories occupied since February, the territory in Donbass that was occupied back in 2014, and Crimea as a third kind of separate case. So I'll end here.
Okay, so this is fabulous. right now, what we have, and this is why we have these experts, we have a great model of everything that's happened to date. We have Putin, who is in charge, not with complete and total power, but with substantial power and constituencies, but with a great deal of freedom of action and a great deal of control. He has obsessed ideas about Ukraine and Russia and Russian empire and Russian greatness and what was taken. Prospect theory would suggest that his framing is of a much larger Russia than is currently exists, and he sees it as trying to get back what is rightfully there. He sees that historically slipping away from him by developments inside Ukraine over the last decade, which therefore creates a closing window of opportunity to right this historical wrong. We could add that he probably saw the West's lack of significant response to his previous predations over the last decade, and the Western disarray and the signals he was getting from some parts of Europe as a sort of yellow to green light for, I can do this and get away with it if I present them with a fait accompli. He was inside a groupthink system, which everybody was feeding him what he wanted to hear and believed his own wishful thinking. And as a result, he tries to make a big grab for Ukraine, take all of it, present the world with a fait accompli, reestablish Russia, and right this historical wrong. That's how we get to the beginning. Is that basically what you guys would both agree with as a narrative going up to February 24th?
It's a brilliant summation.
Okay. Then what we've all seen is this, since then, is what you might call the reality principle coming into the worldview of the dictator who doesn't necessarily get it at home. The extraordinary Ukrainian resistance, the extraordinary national resilience shown by the Ukrainian people and government. No Ashraf Ghani running out in the middle of the night at the first sign of terror, no complete divisions, unification behind a strong political leader who resisted, armed forces that turn out, for those who haven't been paying attention, to have made extraordinary progress in the last 10 years and are fighting at the highest levels of modern warfare, even ahead of others in many respects, since we haven't had too many wars with drones recently, with Western aid to be sure, but Ukrainian forces themselves performing well above what many outsiders would have expected, while the Russians have done the opposite, performing much below what most people expected, showing dramatic differences in the two sides' military capacities compared to what the simple line of forces or distribution of tables of pre-existing reserves would have led you to believe, and which has resulted in Ukraine not just being able to hold out, not just being able to win the Battle of Kyiv, not just being able to push the Russians back from Kharkiv, but also to fight to almost a standstill so far in the battle for the Donbass. And according to what seems like the best military analyses, we seem to be getting to a point in which the Russian forces and the Russian offensives are what in military terms we say culminating, that they've basically thrown in whatever they can throw in without larger mobilization, have tried to piecemeal make more reserves and use up whatever stocks they have available, but are starting to run out of that possibility. And the Ukrainians, not just passionately motivated the way Oksana said, but with increasing aid from the West, which realizes that in fact it's going to back a winner and that the Russians need to be pushed back. The Ukrainians are about to get to the point, according to my read of the situation, where we can see their offensives, counteroffensives, possibly starting to occur in the next few weeks. And so the question I want to raise to both of you is this. You both made a very good case why the ideational factors, the psychological factors, and the Weltanschauung and the ideas in Putin's head led him to this war and will make him highly resistant to any kind of simple Machiavellian, Bismarckian, or Kissingerian calculated walk back, because he really believes this and he thinks it's deeply important and he's committed to it. So my question to you is this: if the reality principle of the war has still not yet dawned and made Putin change his mind, if you can see the Russian forces losing and yet he has not yet changed his goals, what is the point? How do you, at which that happens? What does it take for Ukrainian military success on the ground, physically pushing Russia back? Will we see in the Southeast, assuming, for example, that the West no longer pressures Ukraine to do what Oksana was saying, which is, give them a quick off ramp. If the Ukrainians are able to mount, first of all, do you think the Ukrainians are able to mount military offensives that could possibly take them back to the February 24th lines in the next few months? And second, if they can, will that be enough to make Putin realize, hey, I've lost the war? What will it take to make him realize he's lost? Either one of you.
Oksana, do you want to, or I'll go?
I can start. I mean, it's a lot of questions in there. Let me just sort of pick on a few things, right? I think as far as the military, I mean, I'm not a military analyst or strategist, and when you read the analysis, it seems like you can sort of spin a story either way, right? Like there is one, as you're saying, that the Ukraine is receiving more heavy arms, it's highly motivated, right? Russian army has all sorts of problems. They may have run out of resources, right? Or running out, hard to replenish with the embargo and parts for the weaponry and so forth, right? But they still have a lot of like manpower and firepower, right? And they're essentially leveling down, like literally razing all of these Ukrainian towns and settlements, right? And inflicting casualties on the Ukrainian side as well, about which we don't actually have very clear picture. I think the Ukrainian side was not really forthcoming, like how kind of devastated or not the Ukrainian army is. Like, yes, it's true, they can still mobilize. So I think this sort of, to your question, is it feasible that in the next several months? I think it's feasible, but I don't think it's a guaranteed either, right? So, and I think Ukrainian leadership has been quite careful to sort of prep people for a long war. They just extended state of emergency for 3 months, martial law, rather, right? So I think, like I was saying, so the battlefield would be decisive, right? And then what would Putin do? I think this is exactly sort of a concern on the part of many in Ukraine, that he could potentially, if say things are beginning to look badly for him and he does come to the conclusion that, say, the longer he waits, kind of the worse they would be because Ukrainian army is pushing back, right? He could try to declare a ceasefire at any point and say, like, let's sort of like have a peace deal now, right? And maybe I get control. It seems like it's unlikely they can even capture all of Donbass, but maybe they'll capture, whatever they captured, plus the south of Ukraine, which is the coast. And I can see, how some in the West would say, oh, great, at least now we can have the end of the war. Let's sort of try to come some agreement. As far as Ukrainians are concerned, this would be just buying Putin time to rearm, to remobilize, to get, to kind of get rested and keep, it essentially would be another wave of invasion. But I think he could try to sort of sow this discord among some, countries in the West, which again, as we all know, some sort of more hawkish, to put it this way, like US, UK, right, like Poland, the Baltic countries, but like France, Germany, Italy, right, they might say like, oh, we can sort of, let's have some deal here, right? So I think this is something to watch for. So I can see Putin, yes, he failed to reach his ultimate objective, but getting anything in a way would be better than getting nothing, right? If he does control the coast, it really strangles Ukrainian economy. And as an intermediate victory, if he does have this long-term game, I agree with you, Gideon, that you said sort of like, whatever happens now, if in 30 years I control half of Ukraine, like I go down in history as somebody who sort of corrected historical injustice, right? So I wouldn't put it past him. I think that's quite a realistic scenario if things begin to go badly, that he would try to kind of retake the initiative and propose some kind of ceasefire, but they still get to control some territory.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Tim, same question.
I would say that Putin, yeah, he's driven by, correcting this historical injustice, but he's very flexible. He tried to seize Kyiv very quickly. That didn't work out. He seems to be adjusting in a kind of very reasonable and kind of rational way to say, okay, here's my second best plan. Let's try to take the Donbass and cut Ukraine off in the south and their access to the sea. And that way we could really just dominate Ukraine from that position. I don't think that there's such great support among the Russian people that they would be upset if Putin were to say, We have denazified, whatever that means. We've demilitarized, whatever that means. We've liberated, those people who wanted to be liberated. We're declaring a ceasefire. I don't think from ordinary Russians, I think for the most part would be relieved. I think the support for the war right now is very broad, but it's also very shallow and contingent in that, if Russia's lost somewhere on the order of 8 to 15,000 casualties, Russians don't really understand why the war is happening. They're supposed to be one people, but we're killing them. The Kremlin didn't prepare a narrative to really convince the public. So, and also the elite would be, I think, most upset. But it's also hard to overthrow a personalist autocrat who's been in power a long time. And, he might think he's better off, declaring some ceasefire, having seized enough of Ukraine. So I don't think, his obsession with Ukraine is so great that he would risk losing office for it, or risk doing something crazy like nuclear weapons or chemical weapons. For my mind, so much of Putin's foreign policy has been very calculated, and the invasion of Ukraine seems to be unusual in that regard, much less so than, the annexation of Crimea was very low risk and very high reward. The intervention in Syria happened after it was pretty clear the U.S. didn't really care that much what was going to happen there. And even in Eastern Ukraine, the way Russia supported elements within Ukraine and stocked them with Russian troops, they really tried to downplay their role rather than to play it up. There was no great campaign to say, we're taking back Eastern Ukraine. It was all, we had these volunteers who just happened to be interested in going there. So I think this was really a risk minimization strategy, So I don't know, I think Putin is a very calculating leader, and I think he'll be calculating in the way he tries to end the war as well.
Okay, so this is great. Now we've built another layer to the model, which is the most likely situation now we're facing with something of a stalemate, but about perhaps to turn a little bit, is that Putin might, in effect, his next plan, or a version of his current plan, the most minimal version of the current plan, declare a victory in the East when you still have something that is more than you had to begin with on February 23rd, and in effect do what some of us thought he might do in the beginning, which is another little bite that would be not hugely take all of Ukraine, but enough to keep expanding a little bit, end up maybe with a frozen conflict yet again, but having pushed the line out yet more, and have in effect some gains to show for it. And that's what Oksana is worried about, because that's not inside the Ukrainian sphere of what's acceptable. So that's an interesting one. If he does prove able to hold, if Russian forces prove able to hold a line somewhere between here and the February 24th starting lines, and if Putin acts in the way that you suggest, Tim, and then Oksana, then we might have the situation that Oksana was talking about, in which there's a kind of declaration or pressure to build towards a settlement that is much less than what the Russians wanted in the beginning, but still more than the Ukrainians want to accept, because it represents enough of a victory for Putin to hope that in the long run, this could continue to get the original goals. So now, Mike, that's it. That's a very interesting one scenario to watch. Here's my next question, though. If in fact, the Ukrainian forces can push further with the new weaponry, if in fact the Russians find it hard to do all the supplies, and you get almost what, let's say, is a best case military scenario for Ukraine, not necessarily a Russian collapse, although that's a not impossible possibility, a Russian military collapse. But let's just say it's like a tug of war in which you get pulled back, and before you collapse, you do get to the starting lines, my research on war endings suggests that starting lines are the situation, the status quo ante is a very stable, easily cognitively available place to stop a war that both sides feel sort of should stop. You see it in Korea. You see it in the Gulf War. The border forms or the original line of contact. And my question to you guys is, if you get there, so that he has nothing to show for this war, Putin has nothing to show for this war except the damage inflicted. And then if maybe you even go, as Oksana was saying, a little further and take back some of the Donbass, but leave Crimea. Is he still able to accept a deal like that when he has no military option otherwise, while retaining power inside Russia? What is the point at which Putin has to worry that the defeat is so great that it threatens his standing at home?
So one point that people should be aware of is that, it's much easier to govern as a popular autocrat than an unpopular autocrat. And Putin has been relatively popular, in part because Russians see him as pretty competent. The first decade, living standards soared when Putin came to power thanks to high oil prices. Putin managed that relatively well. The next decade, there was the annexation of Crimea, which again, from the Russian point of view, went very well. Since 2018, though, things haven't gone very well in Russia. There's not really a strong narrative of competence. And if you look at individual indicators of how people view Putin, they see him as less competent. So what's dangerous for Putin is if his popularity falls because people see the invasion of Ukraine as done incompetently. And one of the ways that Putin has been able to stave off challengers is because it's not just that he's popular, it's that he's a lot more popular than the other people in his inner circle who could replace him, right? So should casualties go up, we haven't even talked about sanctions yet in Russia, which is another wild card, and Putin's popularity start to fall, he becomes one of a number of potentially influential people who could rule Russia, but he loses what has been his real trump card, which is his ability to say to his inner circle, look, I can solve the problem with the narod, with the people, the popularity issue. So that's something that I would look for, and I think Putin will be somewhat sensitive to that if he sees the domestic situation, really the wheels really starting to spin off on the economy. Layoffs in some of these big industrial cities that brings people onto the street. The economically are already very unhappy because they've lost tremendously. My sense is that he'll be keen to be seeing what's going on within Russia, and this might give him an incentive to cut a deal before it reaches the point where his rule is threatened.
So in effect, we're going to a race now. It looked earlier like the race was, will the Russians be able to beat the Ukrainians before anybody else could even pay attention and wake up to what's going on? Right. When the Ukrainians held their own early on, it became a race. Can the Ukrainians hold out and get supplied, and can others, help them to hold off the Russians while the Russians doing their attacks? Now that things have sort of come to the middle phase of the war, we're getting closer to the end, and it looks like the race is, will the West be able to maintain its unity, the pressure economically, help the Ukrainian military with aid to the point where they keep the military pressure on Russia long enough before Putin feels the domestic heat from being physically pushed back on the battlefield and increasing the other home. It's an interesting race. So let me ask you a question, Oksana, about Ukraine. Let's say that the worry that you had doesn't pan out, that Ukraine manages to make continuing progress on the battlefield, pushing the Russians back, but the Russians don't respond with a quick ceasefire to try and lock in some gains. They just sort of stubbornly persist in ceding ground and being pushed back slowly. Do you have any worries Or what will the Ukrainians do in that scenario? Is there a point at which we have to worry in the West outside, not about us restraining Ukraine from what it might otherwise do before the end, but us restraining, or the West starting to restrain Ukraine a little bit because we don't want it to go too far? I personally, for example, have been scared a little bit by the unexplained explosions and attacks inside Russian territory. The few rules of the road in the nuclear era that I've studied suggest that you don't threaten the other regime, a nuclear regime, you don't threaten the other's territory, and you shoot for a sort of status quo ante in a limited war in the nuclear age. Is there a worry that if the Russians don't try to seek a ceasefire, the Ukrainians might start upping their goals to actually try to make Russia's pay, and that at some point it becomes really scary?
Let me kind of maybe mention a few things. So first of all, right, like the idea that Ukraine sort of owns not to upset Russia, many in Ukraine don't like that, right? Because at the very least, Ukraine is entitled as any sovereign state to control the territory that it is, you know, recognized in as an UN member state, right? So when I was saying that when Zelensky signaled that he's willing to treat Crimea differently and sort of push the proverbial can down the road and commit to non-military settlement, I think that's wise, right? But at the same time, I don't think, you know, Ukraine would say like, okay, take Crimea because, you know, like just to sort of keep you happy, right? Now, I think pushing into Russia, if it came to that point as in being militarily possible, which I think is a question mark, right? Two things I would mention here. First of all, what we see now is that there is continuing shelling from the Russian territory, even in the territory that Russia left, in the north of Kyiv, in Sumy, right, in Chernihiv area. So that raises the question, is it legitimate, you know, for Ukrainians to protect their own territory, right? Not to go and like send the army to take over Belgorod, but to strike whichever, say, you know, battery of multiple rocket launchers is shelling Chernihiv area from somewhere in the Russian territory, right? Like, I think that's sort of, it's a legitimate question, but that's different from Ukraine sending an army in there, right? Like one could say, if say there was a peace settlement, that there should be some demilitarized zone on both sides of the border, maybe with some peacekeepers who would, I think Ukraine would agree to this. Like, I don't think Russia will, honestly, but I think that would be sort of, it would protect, you know, Ukrainian safety in its border regions without having to go into Russia, which I don't think, you know, Ukrainians are really planning on doing. Again, sort of this defensive war as opposed to offensive war. So I really don't think Ukraine would go in and try to like take over some Russian territory. But at the same time, you know, they do legitimately, I think, want to protect their border regions, which are now being shelled even in the parts where Russia left, right? So I think that would have to be somehow, you know, somehow solved, right? And then another thing I wanted to mention just from this previous conversation you had with Tim, I think it's really interesting. I mean, we don't really know much, obviously, because Russia is such a closed society, but to me, it seems there are a bit of two contradictory things, right? Like one, the power of the propaganda there, how they can sell almost, it seems like anything as victory to the Russian public, right? Because on the one hand, despite this disaster, I mean, objectively speaking, that they tried to take Kyiv in 3 days, there was even a victory article published, how they quote unquote solved the Ukrainian question, right? Like all that had to be backtracked. And, you know, the media did like a fine job with that. So it's not, you know, back to Tim's point, it's not that there is now dissatisfaction in Russian society saying like, oh, this, you know, major goal failed, right? So I think if we kind of broadly speaking, given, I think, the power of the propaganda there, it is quite plausible, at least, that Putin could even say withdrawal from the territory, not only that they control now, but potentially even from Donbass. I think Crimea would be harder, but Donbass, to sell as a victory, they're saying they're really not fighting Ukraine, they're fighting NATO, right? And as you said, like we demilitarized, we destroyed like tens of thousands, or however many they're going to save Ukrainian, you know, armed forces and depots this and, you know, railroads that. So they could, you know, if they wanted to sell, you know, the argument like this. But then I think we also like this decision-making circle is so small. And some sort of like, we don't know, I think we're speculating, but I think it's not impossible that if, say, enough of the closed circle Russian elite decided that Putin is really a liability, that they would have him removed, right? Like, in a way, we can't predict this, but I don't think that could be excluded. They could say, you know, like Gorbachev, that his health doesn't allow. There is all the speculation. He has some advanced cancer, like who knows if he does or if he doesn't. But we've seen this happen before, right? Like you can say that, you know, Vladimir Vladimirovich served the country valiantly and he's now in poor health and he has retired, right? Or some, like, I'm not saying this is necessarily will happen, but I'm saying given how little we know as to sort of really how these decisions are made, right? Like how much support Putin has even among his closest, FSB or whoever he listens to. So if things were to go really badly and say, some other members of the innermost circle would decide that really the obstacle is with him, right? And they see that they could, save political regime, save, their economic wealth, potentially, get sanctions improved if they agree. Like, do they really care about Donbass? I really don't think they do, So I'm just going to throw it in there. Again, I'm not saying this necessarily will happen, but I just want to say that, in these close authoritarian regimes, these sorts of elite coups do happen when people don't really expect them and can't really predict them.
That's like Hemingway said that people go bankrupt gradually, then suddenly. And that's the same way that autocrats fall. One day they're in power and the next day they're not. People coordinate their expectations about what they want, and then they move.
So I'll pick up that one. I'm going to start incorporating questions from our audience, but let me pick up on that one with a little personal history, because in the early 90s, I was on the National Security Council staff dealing with the Middle East. And I remember talking to an old CIA hand at a White House Christmas party about Iraq. And he was saying, how are things going? Because I was in my area. I was a very, very low area, but I was following it all. And I said, well, it's really tough because the situation is so fluid. Either the sanctions are going to work and he's going to be overthrown in a coup because there's such turmoil going on and he's under such pressure that he can't possibly stay too much longer, but we can't possibly keep the sanctions going longer because our coalition is so big. So one way or the other, it's going to jump in the next few months. I just don't know which way it's going to be. And the old guy looked at me and was like, yeah, that's possible. Want to bet? And we often settle these kinds of things for our own things, not because we're callous people, but because it helps you put the odds in question. And I said, sure, which side do you want to take? And he said, oh, I'll let you have both of the tail ends. And I'll just take the situation stays the same. And I said, you're kidding, because I didn't you hear what I said? Either he's going to fall or the sanctions won't be able to be kept up. And he said, I heard what you said. Even money, $20 over the next year. Sure enough, the next year I bump into the same guy again, and he said, I give him the $20 because the situation is exactly the same. And he says, you want to re-up? Because, this situation could, he might fall this year. And I said, I learned my lesson. And I and I made more money off that bet with other people. So things can persist longer than you think. And with regard to and another friend of mine who knew Saddam even better, was the CIA's top analyst of this. When I said to this question, he said, Saddam will not die naturally in his sleep. But at any given year, the bet will be that that's not the year it's going to happen, because his entire regime is geared towards preventing it from happening. Yeah. So it's unlikely at any given moment, although it will happen at some point. That's probably the same thing true for Putin. On the question of the punitive stuff that you were just talking about, Oksana, another Iraq example is interesting because there was an operation in 1998 called Desert Fox. Saddam was trying to escape the sanctions and was doing violating various things. And we were going to, the UN coalition was bombing him in order to get him back to the sanctions table. And there were some people who advocated an open-ended bombing campaign to coerce him back to the enforcement of the sanctions. And the administration at this point didn't want to spend too much time and effort and didn't want to have a loss or an ongoing thing. And so the more cautious voices inside said, no, let's just define this as a punitive mission. If he comes back, that's fine. But this way, we'll just bomb for a few days, destroy some stuff, declare victory, and say that was enough. And so you could imagine very easily a leader saying, our goal was to punish Ukraine. Look how much we have punished them. And now we can stop punishing them. And I, too, like you, have said, felt that the control over the information environment at home, which we wouldn't want to live under ourselves, is nevertheless actually a very good thing when it comes to war termination, because it means that anything can be sold pretty much.
Yeah, if you look at the war aims that Putin has put out there, he can pick and choose which ones he thinks will be the most sellable to the Russian public. Denazification, demilitarization, liberation, these are all pretty vague terms. So, I do think he has wiggle room here. So,
for you guys, just to point out how far we've moved in 2 months or 3 months now. You know, we were worrying about whether Russia would attack supply lines in the West, in NATO countries. And now we're wondering whether Ukraine will attack Russian supply lines and artillery positions inside Russia. It's a, you know, we literally have flipped from one, you know, bad scenario of wider wars to another one that's 180 degrees. It's almost as much as, you know, German foreign policy has flipped. In that regard, let me ask you guys a question. For all that you're experts, there must be something, maybe even many things that have really surprised you about what's happened. If you were to have watched, you know, be told at the beginning of this year, this is what's going to happen, blah, 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 blah. What are the most surprising things that you didn't call that you've just been watching and wonder as they played out?
I have a couple. So I did think Putin was going to invade, and I thought it would, if he's going to invade, he would do it in a big way. So that part, I had a lot of uncertainty, but I did have that view. It's in print somewhere if you want to check, you know, take my word for it. I didn't think he would do it when he did it. I thought he would play it out much longer to show how reasonable and a person he was, and how stubborn the Ukrainians and the West was being. I thought there would be much more of a peace offensive beforehand, and that it would take place later. I was also surprised by how badly the Russian military has done. And I shouldn't have been, because Anthony Bourdain has this great line where he says, when you go into a restaurant and you go into the bathroom and it's dirty, you have to tell yourself, this is the part of the restaurant that they let you see. Imagine what's going on in the parts that they don't let you see, right? So I spend a lot of time studying the parts of the Russian state that we can see, and it doesn't work very well. So why should we think that the parts that we can't see, the most opaque parts, are so efficient and work so much better? The other issue is just morale. You know, I don't think it's important for autocrats to have narratives about why they do what they do. It's hard to coerce people into doing things all the time. It's much better as an autocrat if you have a narrative that you can sell to people about why it's important to do something. And you know, the narrative has been all over the map on the Russian side, and I think that's one of the reasons why morale has been low and casualties have been high, and we haven't seen you know, the Russian troops being willing to take the kind of risks that are often necessary to succeed on the battlefield. So those are a couple things. And then of course the Germans, they you know, they're about face. And if you ever would have told me that, you know, the Germans would be rearming and all of Europe would be applauding, that's even makes it even more surprising. So anyway.
Oksana, what have you been surprised by?
Yes, well, I actually didn't think he was going to invade, exactly because this makes like no sense whatsoever. I mean, this whole plan to have some kind of puppet regime in Kiev, or that they will be welcome, you know, of the Russian troops. I mean, as somebody who knows Ukraine, who studies Ukraine like that, like it was clear to everybody this is complete fallacy. And the task of controlling the country that is hostile of the size of Ukraine is just like, there is no path to victory. Still there isn't, right? But I kind of thought that Putin cannot possibly be so caught in his own misperceptions about Ukraine. So I mean, he clearly was. So that sort of was one thing that surprised me, I could say. And another thing that surprised me, and I'm still really kind of almost sad, I mean, not almost, I am sad about it. It's like the support of the Russian society for this, right? Like the brutality of the Russian troops against Ukrainians, because these are countries, I mean, of course, they're not like one nation, but I mean, they had very close ties. They were family ties. And when you read these accounts of people, you know, in Russia, families, children calling their parents who saying like, we're being bombed by the Russian troops. And they're like, no, you're not, because our TV says otherwise, right? Like, and then you hear all of these horrendous, you know, human rights violations bordering on genocide, right, of the behavior of the Russian troops towards the Ukrainians, right, who speak the same language, like who are like Russian speakers. I mean, that, like, I actually thought, if anything, that would be kind of constraint on Putin's behavior, because it's one thing to go bomb the Syrians out of the sky, who are like some, faraway people, or even Chechens, right, who are different religiously, who are sort of not quite ours, right? Like, yes, they were Russian citizens, but they were not perceived as ours in the way Ukrainians are, right? This is like family almost, right? So that was really, so I think, like, I came to the conclusion that it's not really correct to just consider it Putin's war. I think there is a lot to be studied and said and thought about of the Russian society. Like, what is this? I mean, in some parts of society, there is like really visceral hatred against Ukrainians. I mean, you see that on social media and in the exchanges, and that's something that I guess I didn't expect. I expected, if anything, that would be putting a brake on the invasion instead of kind of supporting it. So that was my big, surprise and disappointment.
Let me press you on that, because you could look at that in two ways. One way is, oh, there were these latent feelings for Ukraine that we didn't realize that it could be tapped into. And the other is, oh, people will just do whatever they're told. And that the identities that are supposedly so strong and permanent and different are actually just whatever is whipped up by a sort of otherization that we can, today it can be a yellow peril, tomorrow it can be a brown peril, or it can be neo-fascist. You can call the Jews Nazis, you can call anybody anything. So I guess my question to you is, do we take from this that there were hidden reserves, or that you could base any government that controls propaganda, hell, we have half a country in the United States that is being told by its media and believing apparently that the election was stolen when there's no evidence that it was. So is the lesson here that people will just believe anything if they're in a sort of closed information environment, or that there actually are identities real, or does this mean they can be constructed and deconstructed at will?
Yeah, no, that's, I think,
yeah,
it's a good question. I think it will be studied, I think for probably some years to come. But I would say, like, yes, propaganda, I think, is important. I mean, there's clearly, the message that Russian public was receiving from, right? But I think it also depends on if it falls on any kind of preconceived prejudice and so forth, right? And there is a long history, in both in Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union, of Russians looking kind of at Ukrainians, kind of like down their nose, right? Like, they were these little brothers, but they were kind of like, the language was funny. And this was like maybe kind of almost benign, we could say. I mean, I certainly came across that. Like, I'm from a mixed family, and, they both Russian, Ukrainian, and my grandmother spoke Ukrainian. And in the Soviet period, when she would go to a store, and like a clerk would tell her, speak like a human being, because she was speaking Ukrainian, right, in Ukraine, and like, it stays with you, right? So I think that was, I don't have a definitive answer to this, but I think it's a combination of things. I think this sort of maybe prejudice against Ukrainians, or sort of this imperial superiority, which was quite widespread, this was not just the elite phenomena, was really whipped up by this propaganda and kind of came together in this, the kind of policies that both the Russian armies pursued, acts, and the way the society supported it. But at the same time, I think you're right. If the propaganda was not there, or if the propaganda was different, right, maybe the reactions would be also quite different, right? Because many people who were maybe torn may have believed their family being bombed instead of the state TV, right? So I think propaganda clearly played an important part.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, before the war, when you looked at Russian public opinion, and prior to the war, you could actually do pretty good public opinion research in Russia. I mean, this was the Russian relations with Ukraine was a pretty low priority issue. Most Russians the economy was in bad shape. Corruption is a major problem. They have enough problems to worry about. War changes things, though. And I think in any country, particularly in Russia, which has a history of being a great power, the rally around the flag, the rally to support your government during the war, it's hard to resist. I think it's hard to admit that your government is doing things that you think are inconceivable. I've been using this analogy about, in the U.S. lost its innocence in Vietnam. In that going into Vietnam, I think most Americans thought that the U.S. was a force for good in the world, right? By and large, it was. Vietnam happens, and you get this massive split between younger people who realize that, well, maybe the U.S. is not always a force for good, and an older generation which continues to hold that belief. And that ripped apart American society for decades, really. I think it's quite possible that you could see a similar thing happen in Russia over time. you already see that people under 40 have a very different view of Putin than people over 60, for example. The information worlds that these two groups live in are very different. And one thing we see from public opinion about wars is that there's almost always a spike early on, and we're still relatively early, but it's just a question of how quickly the decay rate, how quickly the support for the invasion falls. And, if it's the case that sanctions are biting, casualties are higher than expected, and the war looks like it's not being competently fought, I don't think it's inconceivable that people will change their views. I think right now we're still in this period where, people are still buying the Kremlin narrative, but you see it leaking through in different social media, even in the state television. You do see people struggling to explain why it's taking so long. So, the message is getting through a little bit.
Okay, we have a lot of questions that I'm going to group into some batches, maybe even summarize some, because we have a wonderful audience that's submitting lots of things. If you have any, continue to send them in. A lot of them relate to China. So Oksana, first you, then Tim. What is your take on China's role in all this, its relation to this, any aspect? We have several different China, the relation of China to this war, the role it's playing, the role it's likely to play, the implications for it. Any of that.
Yeah, I don't think I have particularly great insight on that to offer at all. It's not something that I follow closely or have expertise on, so Tim will probably say. But I would mention a couple of things. Like one thing, I think in Russian propaganda, since we are on it, they really emphasize that, yes, like instead of saying the world is against us, civilized world, they try to point out that actually majority of the countries, if you count kind of like, are not imposed in this punishing sanctions. So China is on our side, India is on our side, right? Like a lot of African countries and so forth. I think to the extent China is on their side, I think it's questionable. And as Tim says, even in the state TV, sometimes you see this sort of, the commentators would say, well, they're more like fence sitting, they have their own interests, right? Do they really want to be dependent on China? So I think it's a complicated relationship. I think there is, for Chinese, again, as I said, I don't have great expertise, but clearly there is cost and benefit to them. You can sort of see how, like, in some ways it may benefit them to kind of be on the Russian side, but also, there are costs to that. And I think the Chinese leadership is, from what I can tell, kind of more like navigating between these two potential, right? But in Russia, I think they're trying to present China as in their camp. So that's really all I have to say.
Yeah, Tim, a couple of points. First, one Russian foreign policy analyst I know describes the Russia-Chinese relationship in general as, we're not always together. They don't always agree, but they're never openly against each other either. So China's not going to stab Russia in the back. And we've seen some evolution of the Chinese position, where in the beginning, it was much more pro-Russian when it looked like, Russia was going to be able to win, outright. But with the atrocities, I think in particular, China recognized that, backing a pariah state that's fighting with your main economic trading partner might not be such a great strategy. So, there was much more visible discussion of China's position early in the campaign, but they've really gone silent. I think, there's all this talk of Xi was going to be a moderator and all this, and we have seen anything like that. So I think the Chinese are really taking their cue from the facts on the ground. The other point is China and Ukraine actually have large trading relations as well. So it's not just the Russia-Chinese relation. Ukraine's biggest trading partners are not Russia, it's China and the EU. So the situation's even more complicated than the standard discussion of it.
I'll add two little points on this on China, because I've been just talking to some officials and people who study this stuff and like the types that can't tell you how they know things, but they know all the things. And two things that are interesting. One, China is very annoyed because they were trying to split or divide the United States and Europe, and Putin is seen as having driven Europe right back in the arms of the United States with a transatlantic alliance that's stronger than ever in the modern era. And China is like, damn, we were trying to separate them, and now that's highly unlikely. And the other is that they were shocked by the, just like the Russians were, and by the fact that the reserves that Russia had accumulated were so easily wiped out or made non-fungible and useful. And the Chinese have built up extraordinary amounts of what they considered financial leverage on the dollar and incredible reserves that can be deployed to protect themselves or to leverage against the US. And watching the Russians be unable to deploy their financial assets effectively and be in effect screwed financially has made the Chinese very concerned, even more than the weaponry and the battlefield stuff. It's like, oh my God, how do we protect ourselves from this kind of financial punishment that the Russians were unable to protect themselves? There's an interesting angle that we don't see that much in the press.
Oh, that's interesting.
On that point, the financial stuff, another set of questions relates to the West, the home front in the US and in Europe, the extent to which support for the sanctions will continue, support for Ukraine will continue. You could sum this up as saying, over time, as the costs of Ukraine go up and the economic consequences continue, will there be break? You know, how will that affect Western policy towards the war?
A couple points. One is there's some misunderstanding about the sanctions strategy, in that a large part of the sanctions strategy, at least on the US side, was not so much to get the oligarchs to flip on Putin, which I think people realized even from early on was unlikely, but simply to degrade Russia's military capacity and their capacity to use these large reserves to pay off the debts. And by that measure, they're working pretty well. The ruble has been artificially stabilized, but that's not going to be able to continue for indefinitely. We look at the largest tank factory in Russia, and it's running at part-time status. I think automobile outputs are down like 70% in the first quarter of the year because they can't get the microchips they need. I mean, Sheremetyevo, the largest airport in Russia, laid off 40% of its workers because there's so little traffic of goods and people coming. So the sanctions are having all of these effects within Russia that are difficult to anticipate, but are painful all the same. So in the US, this is one of the few issues that the Republicans and the Democrats agree on. Even Lindsey Graham, was meeting with one of Alexei Navalny's right-hand man, I saw on Twitter yesterday, and he, was pledging the Republicans would continue to support. In Europe, it's a much dicier option. But to the extent that Russia has committed, these horrific crimes in Ukraine, it becomes that much more difficult, I think, for European governments to change course. If you remember in 2014, speaking of bets, you could have made a lot of money betting against Europe's commitment to the sanctions, right? Everyone thought, oh, the sanctions will last a year, 18 months tops, then the Germans and the Italians that have so much business interest in Russia, they'll cave. Then the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner happened, and 300 people were killed, many of them from the Netherlands, and it became politically impossible to lift the sanctions. Here we are, 8 years later, the sanctions are still in place. So they might have more staying power than people recognize.
That's a great point. The sanctions, everybody should realize, are much more easy to put in place than they are to lift. And so there's an incredibly inertial bias to them. By the way, usually, because I've written on sanctions, and I usually end up saying, that's why you shouldn't use them. That's why you should be very, very careful not to do them casually. This is the kind of situation in which you want to use them. Reserve them for this kind of thing because they are difficult to, but it's going to be very interesting. Do you worry, Oksana, about the sort of cracks in the Western support?
Yeah, let me mention a couple things. I think the way I look at it, and I think many in Ukraine actually kind of try to make this distinction as well. Like, is the West thinking about this conflict as ultimately just about Ukraine, right? And yes, it's like too bad things happen in Ukraine, but we can sort of contain it there, right? Like, in other words, if Putin were to declare a ceasefire and say he's gonna annex Kherson, well, that's terrible, but like, globally speaking, maybe it's an okay price to pay and will, help Ukraine other ways, right? But the other argument is that this is really a wrong way of looking at it, because you are having here, there are broader implications and broader consequences of appeasing this incredibly aggressive authoritarian regime, right? That just will not end with Ukraine, and you cannot just say, go back to business as usual. And I think in Europe, there is a division on that. Like, I think there are some politicians who would sort of kind of be in the first camp and some in the second camp, right? And the second camp would be emphasizing things such as not only, the massive, crimes that they were committed there, it's rewarding this revanchist kind of 19th century territorial grab, right? This is the regime that has been assassinating political opponents in Western democracies, right? That meddled in Western electoral process. It had said things about Poland and the Baltic countries, like, in other words, like, if they could, like they're already saying that war was NATO. So you really need to contain it, right? Like, so you cannot kind of go back to the business as usual. And I think the more that goes on, the more kind of debate we might see, or at least like it may sort of have its ebb and flow, but I think we will see both of these narratives playing out, in public debate, especially in some West European countries. But I think that there is also even broader aspect to it that we haven't really talked about, say like the global food situation, right? Like, given that Ukraine produces all of these, agricultural products, and there is now, according to the world, what's it called, the World Food Program, right, and the UN, there is really danger of famine or malnutrition in substantial number of developing countries, right? Like, that's again something that would become directly or indirectly a problem for the West as well, right? So in a way, like, you can't just sort of pretend that this can somehow be contained and sort of kept just about Ukraine and kind of go to business as usual. And how do you compel Russia to open Ukrainian ports, right? Like, would we come to the point, even if sort of we talked about the military, like the battlefield situation, right? But if, say, there is a more severe threat or more immediate threat of global food shortage, would Western countries consider deblocking Ukrainian ports militarily, right? Or is this the kind of red line that leads into direct confrontation with NATO, and you can do this, but you can let millions of people starve in the developing world? Like, I think these are the kinds of things that haven't been front and center yet. Like, there is talk about them, but it hasn't really pushed, hasn't come to shove. But in a few months it might, right? And then what?
That's a great point.
Yeah, a Russian official today was asked about this and said, well, if you give us sanctions relief, then, we might consider, releasing them, so this is on their minds as well. It's not clear how this plays out globally. If Russia is seen as being behind it.
They've been stealing grain, they've stolen like, a ton of grain from Ukrainian farmers, and tried actually to sell some of it, I think, to Egypt. It didn't go, then I think it went to Syria. So there is also sort of this, theft. But then, of course, given, I think Ukraine produces some like huge amount of corn and oil, sunflower oil that really feeds a lot of people, right? Globally. So
it's what you said about Ukrainian agency earlier, and that's often left out of the picture, is absolutely true here as well, because nothing succeeds like success. And the fact that the Ukrainians are rapidly turning themselves militarily into the Israelis of Europe, it actually, I think, has made a huge difference, because not only does people want to back a winner, but the more that the more that Ukraine becomes not a liability, but a weapon to punish Russia and an example of the superiority of Western armaments, doctrine, values, whatever, the more it becomes a proxy war, not just in a sort of, oh, we have to do it. I mean, this is starting to look to me right now, frankly, like 1973, like the Yom Kippur War, in which you had a surprise attack, which gained a lot of ground, shocked people, the ability of the Israelis to turn the force of battle around and then launch forward, and then pressed the Egyptian army against the Nile led to a situation in which the Russians came in and said, you can't do this. The Americans stepped in, and the military success of the Israelis paved the way for some kind of solution in which you allowed the Egyptian armies to escape in return for segueing to some kind of diplomatic solution. I don't think we don't have many Kissingers right now, unfortunately, in this regard to make it work. But I think, the extent to which this is becoming a demonstration effect positively for all sorts of the West, I think will also make it easier for people to see why this is something that connects them in a positive way to the conflict.
I mean, the change, to my mind, is so incredible in that February 1st, USAID was supposed to release the call for proposals for a $50 million grant to battle corruption in Ukraine, because the state was so weak that one of the main foreign policy goals was going to be, how can we clean up this corrupt Ukrainian state that's trying but really just can't get the job done. And then a month later, 2 months later, Ukraine looks like it's really punching above its weight. And it's a mixture of a really robust civil society, really astute political leadership, and a real rally given what's at stake for the nation. It's really a remarkable story.
I agree.
I would add to it. I agree with what Tim is saying, but I would add to it. I think on the reform front, I think not to say there was no corruption in Ukraine, but I think this sort of corruption problem was overemphasized, and the successes of the reforms that were undertaken were actually underemphasized, because one of the big reforms Ukraine undertook successfully was this decentralization. And that's really feeds into kind of the civil society, local elite kind of amalgamation locally that we see doing all sorts of things, from delivering food and medicine, undershelling, to evacuating people, to then now planting flowers in Kharkiv, right? And this is exactly because there was sort of this decentralization, more resources went locally, officials were elected locally. So there is much more kind of connection between the people, the citizens, and the elected officials than there was before, right? And we also see this sort of fewer cases of, officials defecting to the Russians, right? And I think that's all of this was not really quite, I think, appreciated, because, sometimes for understandable reasons, there was still a lot of corruption, and that was a problem. And yes, but I think everybody who is now shocked that the Ukrainian state turned out to be as resilient as it did, as capable as it did, I think it did have also some of the origin in more successful reforms that were acknowledged.
I would have been surprised. I would have been skeptical at your saying that, except for the fact that, having watched the military performance, which also was the product of astonishing progress in reforms in the last decade, which were not as visible in the outside until you saw the fruits. It is much more plausible to me now that that was happening, as you said, in the areas we couldn't see. Okay, I'm going to group a bunch of questions now in effective countries, small countries on the periphery for 300. Moldova, Belarus, and let's go with the Baltics, but the Nordics and the North. So we have here, first of all, conflict adjacent countries. Do we have to worry about Moldova and what about Belarus's role in all this? Talk about that for a second. Have they changed their position a little bit? Are they getting cold feet? And also, isn't it, the North, and the fact that this has actually not stopped NATO expansion, but actually led to the greatest expansion in NATO, even in half a century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating for those making the argument that the invasion of Ukraine was really driven by concerns about NATO. That's a much harder argument to make today. Not just that Sweden and Finland have applied to join, but that the Kremlin just kind of shrugged its shoulders at this decision and said, yeah, as long as there's no weapons there, and it seems to be fine. But even Japan, right? They're talking now about changing the really pacifistic elements of their constitution, which are really out of step with modern Japan, which actually does have a big military in response to what they see as a more assertive Russia. So it's not just that in Europe you see this backlash, But, you know, even in Japan, which has had this territorial dispute with Russia over these 4 islands in the east for you know, since the end of World War II, also seems to be changing, or at least it's possible that they will change this really historic position. I think the Baltics and the NATO countries, I think Putin really sees them as different. And, you know, Ukraine is different, and Moldova, you know, is not a NATO, you know, is not, you know, under the same umbrella. So I think they are more at risk, but Oksana might have more sense than I do.
And Oksana, you can take Edward Lippiner's comment on a question about Belarus too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think, I mean, it's maybe a little bit, you know, I don't know, provocative, maybe not the right word, but speculative, let me put it this way. But I think like it is quite plausible that if Putin were to fail in this war, right, and it became clear that, you know, there is some sort of defeat, at least, you know, maybe not the most hardcore supporters in Russia will see, but it will be pretty clear for everybody. We may see the next wave of democratization, quote unquote, because I think regimes such as Lukashenko, also some Central Asian regimes, are really dependent on Russia, right? And if there is sort of, you know, some kind of internal, maybe not even full regime collapse, but some sort of substantial crisis, right? To the point we saw this massive protests in Belarus during the elections, right? There is very little, essentially there is no support in Belarusian society for this war. That's probably why we haven't actually seen Belarusian army enter into this war, which, you know, there was pressure on Russia, from Russia on Lukashenko, but according to the polls, there is something like 4% in the population supported, you know, the invasion. So Lukashenko ended up kind of, yes, he gave his territory and so forth, and I think it still creates problems for the Ukrainians because they have to keep troops along the northern border in case, you know, something happens, so it kind of detracts resources. But I think, you know, Lukashenko, in a way, sort of this domino effect, right? I wouldn't be shocked that if, you know, things go downhill in Russia, we would see waves, you know, reverberating in, you know, in Belarus. And another thing I would bring in, although it was not part of the question, this whole Russia-led, what's it called, Tim? Like the military alliance that they have, the Commonwealth of Independent States.
Yeah, the CSTO.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. They're not sending any troops, right? So you can see, you know, countries that are dependent on Russia in many ways, economically, politically, in Central Asia, right? Tajikistan, they don't want to be part kind of this war. So that's also something to kind of keep an eye on. In Moldova, I mean, again, from what I can tell, that the military contingent there is not substantial in size to really turn the tide of the war. On the other hand, this whole kind of Novorossiya concept, the new Russia, right, extending from Donbass through the south coast of Ukraine, Crimea, definitely Odessa, and connecting with Novorossiya, right? This is something that if, say, Putin were to conclude some kind of favorable to him ceasefire and, you know, frozen conflict, like that could be next on the list, because Odessa was definitely a target. It remains a target. They failed, you know, to capture it, but that kind of connecting it with that part of Moldova. So I think that is in play, maybe not in the immediate and kind of medium to long term for sure, right? And I agree with Tim. I think on the NATO membership for Finland and Sweden, right? It's like, how can you shoot yourself in the foot more than that? Talking about surrounding by NATO, now you're going to have this as a NATO border. First, they threatened some political, military, or whatever military technical measures. Then they said, well, it's actually not a big deal. So it goes again, you can sell a lot of things to the Russian public, right? So yeah, so I think that's another evidence that really this war in Ukraine is not primarily and not mainly about NATO.
Again, 3 months ago, we were talking about or possible solutions, or people were characterizing, oh, maybe Ukraine could be Finlandized. Now Finlandized itself is a concept, you know, Finland has been Ukrainized. Pepita Soto wants to return to the question of nuclear power, nuclear thinking. Are either of you worried about this going nuclear?
I think you should be the one to answer this question.
I
You have the most
no, because I
insights
think
on
it's
it,
not
so,
logical, and I see no logical gains for those use, and I think it would bring on even more opprobrium. And so I don't see it happening unless Putin literally thinks he's at risk, and deeply at risk in an irretrievable way, because he's directly attacked. But I just don't see it. But you guys know more. That's why you're the speakers.
yeah, I think it's a pretty low probability event. It's not as if Russian territory is at risk for all the reasons Oksana pointed out. Russia has traditionally had good civil military relations in that the military generally stays out of politics. But the militaries also don't like to do things that could put their organization at risk. And, this could be one of those situations where there might be pushback to say, we might not do this. I think that's also a possibility. So I don't, we can never rule it out. Obviously, the cost would be tremendous, but it's hard to see how there's a path that gets us to the use of nuclear weapons, barring some very unforeseen option, and even one that, were to put Putin at risk. There might be ways, as Oksana mentioned earlier, to, ease him out in a way that would avoid that, highest rung on the escalatory ladder.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end. This has been fabulous. Let me just ask you one final thing that you guys can wrap up with. One is about policy. Are there any specific questions or specific issues about U.S. policy that should be on people's minds that you would like to advocate for or change? And the second is about the humanitarian situation. We have a question here from Francis McCloskey. I have a bag of self-care items that I want to donate on behalf of displaced Ukrainians, but I'm having a hard time finding a recipient. Who should I donate to? Oksana, also, you can talk a little bit about the migrations, which has been one of your specialty, and the refugees in this brief time, the humanitarian aspects and any policy aspects. Take it away.
Yeah, let me just maybe very briefly address the humanitarian aspect. I mean, one thing that I'll mention was the migration and displacement. It's very important to keep in mind that vast majority of the displaced people want to go back. So that's not, again, something that is sort of people see as a way kind of opportunity to leave, to get to the West, to migrate. The people really want to go back. And of course, the longer this conflict goes on, we might see the reduction of this sentiment, because if people put roots somewhere else, right? So I think the reception that they received in Poland in particular, but in Western Europe in general, I think has been, very encouraging. Although again, you hear it's not equally the same in some countries. I've recently read about Austria, how they're the government is not, so I think humanitarian support continues to be important. For the question where to donate, I think what I would say that donating money here is really much more efficient and much more effective than donating goods. I think some local Ukrainian organizations, if you were to look for, in whichever area you're in, oftentimes the churches, they might collect things such as medical supplies, but they wouldn't collect things such as shampoos or clothing, because that's much more efficient to source that already locally than to pay for transcontinental shipping of these items. But I think for medical supplies, if you have any to donate, those could be donated to local Ukrainian groups.
Tim?
Hey,
Yes, Razom for Ukraine is one that is very well run and has done tremendous work. Also, the Kiev School of Economics is another place where I've given money and really think that they're just doing really heroic works. One policy change I would like to see is we should be doing more to bring the Ukrainians who do want to come to the US to make it easier for them to do it. I think we made the generous offer of 100,000 Ukrainians could come to the US. I think there's 100,000 Ukrainians in Berlin at this time. I mean, surely we as a country can do better. So that would be one thing that I might advocate for.
Thank you very much. Rhoda, back over to you.
okay, thank you so much, Gideon, for a fine job of facilitating this discussion. It was wonderful. Thank you, Tim and Oksana. It was a very dynamic and lively discussion. And I think the questions were good, and I hope all the questions got answered. I just want to say one more thing to our audience that is still here and invite you to our June 16th program, which will be on election integrity or integrity of elections. And we also have a good lineup of speakers for that program as well. And I'd like to urge those of you that are not yet getting our notices of our programs and events to go to our website and to sign up to get these notices. A lot of good programs coming up every single month. So thank you so much. You guys did a fabulous job, and we at NFRPP appreciate it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a great conversation.
Yeah, well, and we'll
Thank you for the
probably do an
questions.
update on this in the near future. Yeah,
I'm sorry. I
Hopefully
speak
it'll be
fast,
a little bit more optimistic and
yeah. So maybe toward the end of the year, we'll see how some of this conversation has evolved. Thank you again,
Thank you.
and good night.
Good
Thanks,
night.
everybody. Bye.